in the days when kingdoms were measured not only by walls and armies, but by the righteousness of their rulers and the favor of heaven upon the land. There lived a king whose dominion was wide and whose wealth was great, yet whose heart was heavy. For though gold filled his treasury and harvests filled his storehouses, sorrow rested upon his household like a lingering shadow, because his queen, beloved and faithful, had borne him children only to lose them, and the cries of newborns had turned too often into the silence of mourning. And the king would walk the palace halls at night seeking comfort, but finding none, until in the fullness of time the queen once more conceived, and this child lived, and joy returned to the palace like rain after drought. And when the child was born, the king offered gifts and prayers, swearing to honor the gods of justice and mercy if the child might be spared. And the child grew, and with him grew hope, yet fate, which walks unseen among men, had not finished its work. For when the prince was still young, the queen fell ill and died, and the king's heart broke anew. And in his grief he took another wife, one whose beauty was bright and whose words were sweet, but whose heart was hidden and whose intentions were not pure. And from this second queen was born another son, and though the king rejoiced at the birth, the palace itself seemed to know that the balance of peace had shifted. For jealousy took root quietly, and ambition whispered where gratitude should have dwelled. And as the years passed, the two princes grew side by side, the elder gentle in spirit and patient in manner, the younger sharp in wit and restless in desire. And the stepmother watched them both with eyes that measured and weighed, loving her own son fiercely while seeing the elder as an obstacle to power. And when the king would sit upon his throne and speak of succession, the queen's heart hardened like clay in the sun, and she resolved within herself that her son must rule, whatever the cost, and so she waited for the right season. For evil often waits until trust has grown strong. And when the time came, she went to the king with tears upon her face and words of concern upon her lips, saying that she feared for the future of the realm, that signs and omens had warned her that one of the princes carried a destiny that would bring ruin unless tested. And the king, weary and longing for certainty, listened, and she persuaded him to send the elder prince away, not in anger, but in the name of wisdom, saying that a journey would strengthen him and reveal his fate. And though the king's heart was troubled, he agreed, believing he acted for the good of all. And so the elder prince was summoned and told that he must travel beyond the borders of the known land, carrying with him neither army nor wealth, but only faith and endurance. And before he departed, the queen called him privately and gave him 2 staffs, one of gold and one of silver, saying that they were gifts of protection and guidance, and that when the time came he would know which to use. And the prince, unaware of her deceit, bowed respectfully and accepted them. And thus began the journey that would test not only his strength but his soul. For the golden rod and the silver rod were not merely objects of metal, but instruments bound to destiny. And as the prince stepped beyond the palace gates, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. For the path ahead led through forests where truth and illusion walked together, through deserts where faith is stripped bare, and toward a fate written long before his birth. And so ends the first telling, as the chosen one walks forward, carrying in his hands the tools of judgment and redemption, not yet knowing that kings will fall, curses will break, and justice will rise through trials that only the faithful can endure. As the elder prince journeyed onward beyond the reach of the palace towers, the dust of the road rose beneath his feet, and the sound of the city faded like a memory already turning into legend. And he walked alone beneath wide skies, carrying the golden rod and the silver rod wrapped in cloth upon his back, unaware that each step forward carried him farther from innocence and closer to the unfolding of a destiny, written not by men but by unseen hands. And the land through which he travelled was vast and varied, filled with villages where the poor laboured quietly, and forests where the wind spoke in whispers older than kings. And in the first village he entered, he saw hunger upon the faces of the people, for their wells had dried and their crops had failed. And the elders told him that a curse had settled upon the land, brought by a serpent spirit dwelling in the nearby hills. And the prince listened with compassion and remembered the rods given to him. And though he did not yet understand their power, he took out the silver rod and struck the dry ground. And at once water burst forth as from a hidden spring, flowing freely and bringing life back to the soil. And the people marveled and blessed him, calling him chosen, though he himself bowed and gave glory to the divine order that governs all things. And he moved onward, learning that mercy opens doors no sword ever could. And as days turned into weeks, he reached a dense forest where light barely pierced the canopy. And there he encountered beings twisted by enchantment, men turned half into beasts by ancient wrongs. And they surrounded him with cries of rage and sorrow. But when he raised the golden rod, the air grew still, and the curse broke like chains struck by lightning, restoring them to human form, and they fell before him in tears, saying that the golden rod carried judgment that destroys evil but restores the innocent. And thus the prince learned that the silver rod brings life and healing, while the golden rod brings truth and justice, and that neither was meant for pride or conquest, but for balance. And yet, even as he grew in wisdom, danger followed quietly, for word of his journey spread like fire across the land, reaching ears that hungered for power. And among those ears were the servants of his stepmother, who had secretly sent hunters and sorcerers to ensure that the prince would never return. And one night, as he slept beneath the open sky, they crept upon him, casting spells of sleep and shadow. But the rods glowed with unseen fire, and the spells broke before touching him, and the hunters fled in terror, spreading tales of a prince protected by heaven itself. And the journey pressed on through deserts where thirst tested faith, and mountains where pride is crushed by height. And in every trial the prince chose humility over fear, compassion over vengeance, and obedience over desire. And the rods responded not to strength of arm but purity of heart, growing warmer when truth was near and heavy when deceit lay ahead, until at last he reached a kingdom ruled by a cursed king, whose throne was bound by bloodshed and whose people lived in fear. And the king demanded that the prince prove his authority, threatening death if he failed. And the prince stood calm and struck the ground with the golden rod, and the walls of illusion fell away, revealing the king's crimes to all. And then he lifted the silver rod and healed the land, restoring justice and peace. And the people rejoiced and offered him the crown, but he refused, saying the power not given by rightful order must not be taken. And so he departed once more, carrying with him not riches but wisdom, not glory but resolve. And as he walked onward toward lands yet unknown, the heavens themselves seemed to watch in silence, for the path ahead would lead him toward the greatest trial of all, where truth and betrayal would collide, where blood and destiny would meet, and where the golden rod and the silver rod would finally reveal why they had been placed in his hands from the beginning. As the prince continued his journey, carrying with him the weight of all he had seen and learned, the road before him grew narrower and more perilous, leading into lands spoken of only in whispers. where truth was tested not by strength, but by endurance of spirit. And it came to pass that he reached a desolate plain where the sky seemed low and the wind carried voices of lament. And there he found a city turned to stone, its people frozen in postures of fear and grief. And an aged hermit approached him, clothed in rags and ash, saying that this city had been judged for the cruelty of its ruler, who had traded justice for power and bound himself to dark forces. And the curse would not be lifted unless one pure of heart dared to confront the source. And the prince felt the weight of the golden rod grow heavy in his hand, and knew that judgment must come before restoration. And he walked alone into the ruined palace where shadows clung to the walls like living things. And there he faced the spirit of the fallen king, swollen with pride and hatred, who mocked the prince and promised dominion if he would abandon mercy. But the prince answered not with anger but with truth, striking the ground with the golden rod. And the illusion shattered like glass, revealing the spirit's weakness. And the judgment fell, not in rage but in righteousness. And the darkness dissolved. And when the prince emerged into the light, he raised the silver rod, and the stone people breathed again, flesh returning where stone had been, and cries of awe rose as the city was restored. And the people bowed, calling him deliverer. Yet again he refused honor, saying that deliverance belongs to the order above all kings. And as he departed, the hermit revealed himself as a messenger of the ancient covenant, declaring that the prince's trials were not accidents, but steps toward a final reckoning. For the rods were forged long ago to restore balance when royal blood would be tested by betrayal. And the prince's heart grew heavy, knowing that his path would soon lead him back toward the land of his birth, where the greatest deception awaited. And as he journeyed onward, signs appeared in the heavens, stars shifting, winds changing, and dreams coming unbidden in the night, warning him that the one who sent him away had not ceased her plotting. And in those dreams he saw his younger brother upon the throne, crowned but uneasy, and the kingdom trembling under unseen weight. And he awoke knowing that the final trial would not be against beasts or cursed kings, but against blood and truth entwined. And yet he did not turn aside, for his heart was steady. And the rods no longer felt like tools, but like witnesses, responding to his thoughts and prayers. And when at last the towers of his homeland rose again on the horizon, the land itself seemed to recognize him. The earth firm beneath his feet, the wind gentle at his back, and thus he returned not as a child sent away, but as one shaped by trial, carrying judgment in one hand and mercy in the other, ready to face the destiny prepared for him before his first breath was drawn, as the prince crossed the final hills and entered again the land of his birth. The soil beneath his feet felt both familiar and changed, as though the earth itself remembered his departure and waited in silence for his return. And the villages he passed through bore signs of unease, for though the kingdom still stood strong in stone and banner, fear moved quietly among the people like a hidden sickness. And when he listened to their whispers, he learned that his father, the king, had grown old and weak, that council in the palace had turned sharp and divided, and that the younger prince, guided by the voice of the queen, now stood closest to the throne. And the elder prince felt sorrow rather than anger, for he knew that power gained through deception poisons both ruler and land. And as he journeyed closer to the capital, word of his return spread, carried by traders and shepherds, until it reached the ears of the queen, whose heart hardened like iron, for she had believed him long dead, and now fear seized her. And she summoned her son and the captains loyal to her, weaving lies with skill, saying that the elder prince had returned, corrupted by dark magic, that he carried weapons forged to seize the throne and destroy the kingdom. And she urged them to prepare the guards to arrest him at the gates. And so when the prince finally reached the outer walls of the city, he was met not with welcome but with armed men and raised voices. And though he could have lifted the golden rod and brought judgment swiftly, he chose patience, lowering both rods and allowing himself to be bound. For he knew that truth revealed at the wrong time can be twisted into further deceit. And he was brought before the court, where his father sat upon the throne, frail and clouded in mind, and the queen stood beside him, veiled in false concern, and she accused the prince openly, claiming he had allied himself with forbidden powers and sought the downfall of the realm. And the younger brother stood silent, torn between blood and ambition, and the court murmured, divided in heart. And when the king looked upon his elder son, recognition flickered, but doubt quickly followed, for the queen's words had long poisoned his trust. And the king ordered that the prince be tested, declaring that if he was innocent, the gods would reveal it. And so they led him to the ancient hall of trials beneath the palace, a place long unused, where truth was said to rise like fire and lies to crumble like ash. And there the queen had secretly prepared a trap, for she had summoned sorcerers to bind the hall with illusion, hoping to turn judgment into death. And when the prince entered the chamber, the air grew heavy and the walls seemed to breathe. And voices rose accusing him, and visions formed to break his resolve. But the rods in his hands began to glow, the silver rod warm with steady light, and the golden rod burning with fierce clarity. And the prince lifted his voice not in defense, but in prayer, calling upon the eternal order that governs kings and beggars alike. And when he struck the floor with the golden rod, the illusions shattered, the sorcerer's power dissolved, and their deceit was laid bare before all. And the hall trembled as truth rushed in like wind through broken doors. And then the prince lifted the silver rod, and the air cleared, peace settling where fear had reigned. And those watching from above felt their hearts stirred, for the power they witnessed was not cruelty, but righteousness joined with mercy. And the guards fell back in awe, and word raced upward through the palace, reaching the throne room like thunder. And the king was carried down to see with his own eyes. And when he beheld his elder son standing unbound amid broken lies, memory returned to him like light at dawn. And he wept, for he saw not rebellion but faithfulness proven through suffering. And the queen's face grew pale, for her schemes had failed, yet her pride would not bend. And she cried out one final lie, accusing the prince even as the truth lay exposed. And it was then that the golden rod grew heavy in the prince's hand, for judgment had come not by force but by revelation. And all waited in silence, knowing that the fate of the kingdom now rested not upon ambition but upon the balance of justice and mercy held by the one who had walked through exile and trial. And so the prince stood, neither rushing nor retreating, for the final reckoning was near. And the destiny bound to the golden rod and the silver rod was about to be fulfilled before the eyes of all, as the silence in the hall of judgment deepened, and every breath seemed to wait upon the will of heaven. The elder prince lifted his eyes and looked not first at the queen, nor at the courtiers, nor even at the throne, but upward, as one who knows that true authority does not rise from stone seats or jeweled crowns. And in that moment the golden rod in his right hand glowed with a fierce and steady light, not the fire of anger but the clarity of truth, and he spoke calmly, saying that judgment does not belong to vengeance but to righteousness, and that power unrestrained by mercy becomes destruction. And all who listened felt the weight of his words settle like rain upon dry ground. And the queen, seeing that her lies had failed and her schemes had been uncovered, attempted to flee, but the guards did not move, for their hearts had been pierced by truth, and their loyalty shifted not by command, but by awakening. And the king, trembling with age and sorrow, rose from his seat and called the elder prince by name, and in his voice was both repentance and relief. For the son he had lost now stood before him, not hardened by exile, but refined by it. And the king confessed before all that he had been blind, that he had listened to whispers rather than wisdom, and that the kingdom had suffered because of his weakness. And then the prince turned toward his younger brother, who stood torn between fear and shame, and instead of accusation, the prince extended the silver rod, whose light was gentle and warm. And he said that blood cannot be erased by rivalry, and that mercy offered freely has the power to heal what ambition breaks. And the younger brother fell to his knees, weeping, for in that mercy he saw his own guilt reflected without condemnation. And the court watched as reconciliation unfolded where execution had been expected. And the queen, stripped of her influence and exposed in her deceit, was removed from the palace not by cruelty but by decree, exiled from power so that the land might breathe again. And the king placed his crown upon the elder prince's head. Yet the prince did not take the throne immediately, for he knelt and raised his father up, declaring that honor does not rush to replace but waits to restore. And peace returned to the kingdom, not through bloodshed but through balance, as justice was upheld and mercy preserved. And in the days that followed, the elder prince ruled not as a conqueror but as a shepherd, holding the golden rod to judge corruption and the silver rod to heal the wounded. And under his reign the land prospered, not merely in wealth but in trust, for the people saw that authority guided by righteousness brings stability and hope. And the tale of the golden rod and the silver rod was written not as a legend of power seized, but as a testament to faithfulness tested and mercy victorious. And as years passed and the prince became king in full, he placed the rods within the sanctuary, declaring that no ruler should wield them without humility, for they were symbols not of domination but of divine balance. And thus the story came to rest, not in triumph alone, but in wisdom passed forward, teaching that those who endure exile with faith return not to claim revenge but to restore order, and that true kingship is proven not in the moment of ascent but in the choice to rule with justice in one hand and mercy in the other. And so the kingdom endured, and the land found peace, and the memory of the golden rod and the silver rod remained as a quiet witness that destiny bows to righteousness, and that mercy, when joined with truth, becomes the strongest force under heaven. As the years unfolded quietly beneath the reign of the rightful king, the land learned that peace is not loud and justice does not boast. For the elder prince who had become king ruled with a steady hand and a listening heart. And the people prospered not because laws were harsh, but because truth was clear and mercy was near. And travelers who passed through the kingdom spoke of a place where the poor were heard, the strong were restrained, and the broken were restored. And the king himself walked among his people without fear, remembering the dust of exile and the hunger of the road. And he taught his judges to weigh matters slowly, and his generals to value restraint over conquest. And when disputes arose, he would stand before them, holding neither sword nor crown, but speaking plainly, reminding them that authority exists to serve what is right and not to exalt itself. And though the golden rod and the silver rod rested within the sanctuary, their meaning lived on in the king's actions. For judgment was firm yet measured, and mercy was generous yet wise. And the younger brother, once torn by ambition, grew into a faithful steward of the realm, governing provinces with humility learned through forgiveness. And the scars of betrayal became lessons rather than wounds, and the exiled queen faded into memory, a warning written not in bitterness but in history, teaching that pride may rise swiftly but falls by its own weight. And as the king aged, he gathered the children of the land and told them the story of the rods, saying that gold alone blinds and silver alone weakens, but together they teach balance. And he warned them that power without compassion turns rulers into tyrants, and mercy without truth turns nations into chaos. And when his days drew near their close, he walked once more to the sanctuary where the rods lay, now dim with age, yet heavy with meaning, and he knelt, giving thanks not for the throne he held, but for the trials that shaped him. And he prayed that those who came after him would remember that exile can refine, and suffering can prepare the heart for leadership. And when he died, the people mourned, not with fear, but with gratitude, for they had been ruled by one who chose restoration over revenge. And generations later, elders would still speak of the golden rod and the silver rod, not as weapons of legend, but as symbols of a truth older than kings. That righteousness lifts a nation, and humility sustains it. And thus the story was sealed not with conquest, but with wisdom, not with bloodshed, but with peace. And those who listened in later days would understand that the greatest victories are not won in battlefields, but in the quiet choices to stand for truth, to extend mercy, and to trust that justice, guided by compassion, endures beyond the rise and fall of every throne. As generations passed, and the memory of the king who ruled with judgment and mercy blended into the rhythm of history, the land itself seemed to carry his story in its soil and stone. For children born long after his reign would walk the roads he once traveled and feel an unspoken peace without knowing its source. And elders would tell them that this calm did not come by chance, but was planted long ago by a ruler who chose righteousness over revenge and balance over pride. And the sanctuary where the golden rod and the silver rod rested became a place of quiet instruction rather than spectacle, visited not by those seeking power, but by those seeking wisdom. And scribes recorded that whenever a ruler ruled harshly or a judge bent truth for gain, unrest would stir like dust in the wind. Yet when leaders remembered the ancient balance, justice would return as surely as morning light. And travelers from distant lands came to learn not of military strength, but of governance shaped by restraint, asking how a kingdom survived without tyranny. And the teachers would answer that strength anchored in mercy does not rot, and authority bound to truth does not collapse. And over time, the rods themselves faded from sight, hidden not by theft, but by intention. For it was said that when symbols are worshipped more than meaning, wisdom departs, and thus the rods were entrusted to memory rather than display. And poets spoke of them in quiet verses, not as magical instruments, but as reminders that judgment must always answer to righteousness, and mercy must never abandon truth. And in times of drought or unrest, the people did not cry out for new rulers, but returned to old teachings, asking whether their ways had drifted from balance. And in doing so, they discovered that the legacy of the elder prince was not confined to one life or one throne, but lived wherever choices were weighed carefully and power was held gently. And so the story endured, not as legend alone, but as instruction written into conscience, teaching that exile can shape leaders more faithfully than privilege, that suffering can temper ambition into wisdom, and that true authority listens before it commands. And even when centuries later kingdoms rose and fell around them, the people remembered that peace is preserved not by walls or weapons, but by hearts trained to discern when to lift the golden rod of justice and when to extend the silver rod of mercy. And thus the tale of Sonar Kathi O Rupa Kathi continued beyond words and pages, living quietly in decisions made in courts, in homes, and in moments unseen, reminding all who listened that destiny bows not to force but to faithfulness, and that the balance between judgment and compassion is the true inheritance passed from generation to generation, enduring long after crowns have turned to dust and names have faded into history. And it came to pass that long after the king, who bore exile and wisdom, had returned to the dust, the land entered a season of quiet testing, not marked by war or famine, but by forgetting. For when peace lasts long, memory grows faint, and a generation arose who knew the prosperity of the kingdom, but not the cost by which it had been secured. And judges began to favor convenience over conscience, and leaders spoke softly of mercy, yet withheld justice, and others enforced justice without compassion. And the ancient balance trembled like a scale weighted unevenly, and elders gathered in the outer courts, recalling the words once spoken by the righteous king, warning that when judgment and mercy are separated, both lose their strength. And in those days a young scribe, born of humble lineage and unknown beyond his village, began to study the old records, not for ambition but for understanding. And he read of the exile of the elder prince, of the deception that tested him, and of the rods that symbolized the eternal order. And as he read, his heart stirred with recognition, not because he sought power, but because he saw the pattern repeating. And he traveled quietly through the land, listening more than speaking, observing courts and marketplaces. And wherever imbalance ruled, he spoke gently, reminding leaders that authority exists to restore, not to dominate. And though some mocked him, others listened, and peace returned in small measures, like rain upon dry soil. And when questioned about his authority, the scribe answered that truth needs no throne and wisdom needs no crown. And word of him spread slowly, not by decree but by effect. And though no golden rod rested in his hand and no silver rod shone at his side, the spirit of their meaning lived in his choices. And elders would whisper that the legacy had not vanished but matured, no longer bound to objects or lineage, but written into discernment itself. And thus the story continued, not as a tale of kings alone, but as a testimony that righteousness renews itself in every generation willing to remember. And the balance once carried by rods was now carried by hearts trained in humility, proving that the truest inheritance is not passed through blood or relics, but through understanding, preserved by those who choose wisdom over pride and truth over comfort. And so the quiet work of restoration moved forward unseen, sustaining the land just as surely as the king once had, reminding all who listened that the story of Sonar Kathio Rupa Kathi never truly ends. For wherever justice and mercy meet, the ancient covenant lives again. And so the quiet renewal spread across the land like dawn that comes without announcement. For the words spoken by the humble scribe took root not through command but through conscience, and households began to settle disputes with fairness, judges paused before ruling, and leaders weighed consequences with greater care, remembering that authority is a trust rather than a possession. And in time the scribe grew old and returned to his village, leaving behind no monument except changed hearts. And elders recorded that his influence endured because he sought no reward and claimed no title. And seasons passed, and once more the kingdom stood firm, not because of fear or force, but because balance had been restored. And children were taught not only the names of kings, but the meaning of justice joined with mercy. And teachers would tell them that long ago a prince carried two rods, one of gold and one of silver. Yet the true lesson was never the metal, but the wisdom behind it. And as generations followed one another, the story was spoken less as history and more as guidance, reminding all who heard it that power tested by exile becomes wisdom, that truth revealed patiently outlasts deception shouted loudly, and that the greatest legacy a ruler leaves is not wealth or conquest, but a people trained to choose what is right even when unseen. And thus the land endured through times of calm and times of trial, always returning to the ancient balance when unrest arose. And travelers passing through would say that something unseen guarded the kingdom, and the elders would answer quietly that it was not walls nor armies but memory. And so the tale continued. N.